if you've ever moved out of, um, you know, a notoriously toxic roommate's house, you know that packing your boxes and just getting out of that chaotic environment is really only half the battle.
Oh, for sure. That's actually the easy part.
Right. I mean, you swear you're going to build a completely different kind of living situation, but then you realize the new neighborhood you're moving into is just as wild.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you don't establish a completely ironclad set of new house rules, well, you're going to end up right back where you started.
You'll just fall back into the exact same patterns.
Absolutely. So today we are doing a deep dive into a set of notes with the extremely blunt title, Not to Have Sex with -4cat.docx, which I know it sounds like an HR file or something.
It really does.
But it's actually an incredible look into the ultimate ancient house rules.
Mm.
We're talking about a sociological framework of Leviticus 18.
Yeah, and the mission for this deep dive is really to completely reframe how we look at these ancient codes. Because, we have this modern tendency to view them as just rigid, arbitrary lists of don'ts.
Like they're just designed purely to restrict people from having fun.
Exactly. But what we actually uncover when we analyze the historical context is a highly intentional, basically a structural engineering plan for human flourishing. It's about family stability and societal protection.
Okay, let's unpack this because the historical context here perfectly mirrors that toxic roommate situation I mentioned.
It really does.
I mean, Israel has just escaped Egypt. That is the deeply dysfunctional household they are leaving behind.
Right, centuries of it.
And now they are heading into Canaan, which is the new, equally volatile neighborhood. The instructions explicitly tell them not to emulate the practices of either Egypt or Canaan. They are being tasked with building a society entirely from scratch.
And what's fascinating here is the core principle anchoring all of these new rules. It's this repeated phrase, I am the Lord your God. It appears constantly throughout the framework.
Yeah, I noticed that in the notes. It's everywhere.
Yeah, and this isn't just a divine signature at the bottom of a legal contract. It establishes that these sexual ethics are fundamentally tied to the whole concept of holiness.
Okay, wait. I need to explain it like I'm 5 for the word holiness here.
Yeah.
Because today, we use that word to describe someone who is morally perfect, or maybe a little pious, or honestly even kind of out of touch with reality.
That's a great point. But in the ancient Near East, holiness carried a very different weight. It literally meant set apart or distinct.
Okay, so not necessarily just moral purity, but being fundamentally different.
Exactly. It was about having a unique identity that was completely separate from the surrounding cultural chaos. And to build a distinct, functional society, you can't just rely on abstract philosophy.
Right, you need tangible rules.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have to start at the absolute foundational level of human connection.
Which brings us straight to the immediate family unit. The direct bloodlines. We're talking mothers, sisters, half-sisters, daughters, granddaughters. The absolute bedrock boundaries.
The primary categories, yes.
But wait, wasn't this already considered morally wrong long before the law was actually written down in Leviticus? Like, people sort of implicitly knew this was bad, right?
Oh, absolutely. The rules laid out here are really just codifying what was already understood. They're making it official for a newly forming nation. And the historical record actually provides a devastating look at what happens when those bedrock boundaries are ignored.
Are you thinking of the Amnon and Tamar story?
Yeah, exactly, from 2 Samuel. I mean, it's incredibly tragic. Amnon was King David's oldest son, right? The heir to the throne. And Tamar was his half-sister.
Oh, man. Yeah, and he feigns an illness, lures her into his quarters, and just forces himself on her.
Right. And the fallout from that single act?
It isn't just a private family tragedy or a minor scandal.
Yeah, not at all.
It acts like a contagion.
Yeah.
It destroys the entire kingdom. Tamar's full brother, Absalom, basically stews in hatred for 2 whole years.
Yeah, just building up resentment.
And then he eventually murders Amnon in cold blood. And if that wasn't enough, he then launches a full-scale civil war against his own father, King David.
It's staggering when you map it out. That one breach of a primary relational boundary literally tore the royal family apart. It cost tens of thousands of lives in the resulting war.
Yeah, about tens of thousands.
It illustrates exactly why the boundary is completely non-negotiable. Because when the primary family unit fractures, the entire society built on top of it destabilizes and eventually just collapses.
Okay, so immediate family makes total sense. You've got proximity, extreme power dynamics, genetic issues, all of that.
Right.
But the rules push further out to extended family, too. Like aunts, for example, the father's sister or the mother's sister. The genetic risk there is significantly lower, and the physical proximity isn't always as tight. So why is the prohibition just as severe?
It comes down to generational boundaries. Society basically relies on predictable, safe family roles to function smoothly.
Okay, predictable roles.
Yeah. These specific rules prevent the collapsing of generational distinctions. If you remove the clarity of those roles, you just invite chaos into the entire community.
Right. I like to think of it like the load-bearing walls of a building.
Well, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, if you mess with a load-bearing wall, you aren't just staining the carpet or like hanging an ugly picture. You are compromising the structural integrity of the entire house.
You bring the whole thing down.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So if an aunt is suddenly a wife, you are knocking out a primary support beam. The generational distinctions just completely collapse. The roles of aunt and niece and cousin are entirely confused under the weight of this new dynamic.
Yeah, the whole family tree gets twisted into a knot.
Exactly.
And the underlying logic here is the protection of family structure, not just genetic purity. God is protecting the design. If roles become fluid, vulnerable members can be exploited by older generations, and the structural integrity of the community just fractures permanently.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it makes logical sense to ban genetic relationships to protect the bloodline and the structure. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, where are we going?
The framework suddenly pivots to forbidding relationships that have zero genetic overlap whatsoever, like absolutely none.
Category 3, the one flesh relationships.
Yes, we're talking about relationships made purely by marriage.
Yeah.
Stepmothers, daughters-in-law, a brother's wife. Why the extreme severity for people who share absolutely no DNA?
Well, this requires a deep understanding of what a covenant actually meant in the ancient world.
Okay, lay it on me.
Because today, marriage is often viewed as a legal contract. If it doesn't work out, you dissolve it with a mediator and some paperwork, right?
You just sign some forms and move on.
Exactly. But in the ancient Near East, a covenant was a legally binding life or death treaty. The concept of becoming one flesh wasn't just like a poetic metaphor you read at a wedding ceremony. It meant a real, tangible relational unity had actually been created.
Wow. So violating that union, even if the person is an aunt by marriage, is viewed as entirely equivalent to violating the blood relative themselves.
Exactly. And applying that logic reveals a massive tension in one of the most famous historical examples from this era.
The story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38.
Yes. Judah and his daughter-in-law.
I am completely stuck on this story, honestly, because we just established that the daughter-in-law relationship is the ultimate taboo. It's super restricted.
Right, it's a huge violation.
But in this narrative, Judah's son dies, leaving Tamar a widow. Judah promises his youngest son will marry her when he comes of age, but then he just totally bails on that promise.
He essentially abandons her, yeah.
Right. So Tamar disguises herself, Judah sleeps with her, having absolutely no idea who she is, and she gets pregnant. So if this one flesh boundary is so absolute, why does the narrative seemingly let Tamar off the hook and point the finger of ultimate blame at Judah?
It's a great question, and to understand that tension, we have to introduce the concept of the levirate duty.
Okay, what is that?
In this ancient patriarchal system, a widow without a child was in extreme danger. She had no economic support, no inheritance, and zero social standing. She was totally vulnerable.
Just completely exposed to the elements.
Basically, yes. So if a husband died without an heir, it was his brother's duty, or in this case, the patriarch's duty, to marry the widow and provide an heir. This preserved the deceased man's lineage and, crucially, protected the woman.
Okay, so Judah completely failed in his foundational societal duty. He abandoned Tamar to essentially starve or just live in total disgrace.
Right, and Tamar took matters into her own hands to secure the family line and, honestly, her own survival. The narrative exposes Judah's hypocrisy because he's the one who shirked his responsibility to the vulnerable.
He even publicly admits it later, doesn't he? Like,
Yeah.
she is more righteous than I.
He does, but here's the key. The relationship itself still falls under the severe prohibition because it represents a total breakdown of family order. It's a glaring symptom of a deeply broken structural system.
Which actually brings up a really fascinating caveat in the notes. The boundary against marrying a brother's wife is normally completely firm. But this levirate duty shows it can actually be overridden.
Right, but only for highly specific covenant purposes. Like in Deuteronomy 25, if a brother dies childless, the surviving brother is explicitly instructed to marry the widow.
So the rules aren't just this arbitrary blind list of taboos.
Not at all. The boundary is incredibly firm to protect the family from internal exploitation, but it is designed to flex specifically to ensure the survival and protection of a vulnerable family member.
I love that. It's like advanced structural engineering. You reinforce a wall to protect the house, but you purposefully build a doorway in it so people can actually escape a fire.
That is exactly what it is. The entire mechanism is designed to protect the vulnerable. And we actually see the inverse of that protection in stories of extreme political rebellion.
Oh, like when someone uses the family structure as a weapon.
Exactly. Take Reuben sleeping with his father Jacob's concubine, Bilhah. Or Absalom, who publicly slept with King David's concubines on the roof of the palace in Jerusalem.
Yeah, those definitely were not crimes of passion.
No, they were calculated political coups. In that era, claiming a patriarch's or a king's harem was a public claim to his authority and his throne.
Wow.
Violating the one-flesh boundary wasn't just a personal failing, it was open rebellion and a direct attack on the structural hierarchy of the family.
And the consequences were huge. Reuben lost his birthright entirely because of it.
Yep.
And Absalom triggered a national civil war. The severity of the rule really matches the severity of the societal damage it prevents.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if single marital bonds carry that much weight, what happens when multiple family lines intertwine? This moves us into category 4. The highly complex overlapping dynamics of blended families.
This is where things get really messy.
Yeah, the framework specifically prohibits relations with a wife's family line, like her daughter or granddaughter, and it explicitly forbids marrying a wife's sister while the
Yep.
wife is still alive.
Right, because blended families create entirely new avenues for power imbalances and exploitation. The patriarch in these ancient families held immense social, economic, and physical power.
Almost total control.
Yeah. So bringing multiple vulnerable women from the exact same family line into one household was just a recipe for systemic abuse.
I mean, think about the dynamic of marrying two sisters. Talk about extreme structural stress. It's like locking a family in a pressure cooker without a release valve. You are just guaranteeing a massive explosion.
You really are. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, history provides the perfect case study for that exact pressure cooker. The story of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel.
Oh man, yeah, Genesis 29 and 30.
Exactly. Jacob works 7 years to marry Rachel, is tricked by his uncle into marrying her older sister Leah instead, and then works another 7 years for Rachel.
And crucially for our listeners to understand, this arrangement was completely culturally accepted at the time. Like nobody blinked an eye at the setup.
Right. The surrounding culture thought it was perfectly fine. But look at the generational trauma it produced. The household became a literal battlefield of fertility.
It was so toxic.
The sisters weaponized their pregnancies to win Jacob's affection. The rivalry became so intense they even threw their own servant girls into the mix as surrogates, basically just to score points against each other.
Yeah, and the psychological toll on the children was massive. I mean, the intense jealousy eventually led Leah's sons to turn on Rachel's firstborn son, Joseph.
Right.
They threw him in a pit, sold him into slavery, and then presented a bloody coat to their father, claiming he was eaten by a wild animal.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't get more dysfunctional than that.
It fractured their family for a generation. It was just a miserable, toxic way to live. And this narrative perfectly illustrates exactly why God later expressly forbade the practice. These codes serve as protective guardrails against a patriarch exploiting his power, and they prevent the tearing apart of women who are forced into these impossible competitive dynamics within their own family.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? We've decoded the bloodlines, the one-flesh covenant relationships, and the intense pressure cookers of blended families.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. And the overarching conclusion is that relationships close by birth and relationships made close by covenant are both sacred. Both are load-bearing walls in the architecture of a healthy society. So the question is, are you shaped more by your surrounding culture or by a higher protective design?
Yeah, that's the core of it. The analysis really presents 4 major takeaways for a modern audience here. First, it argues that ultimate relational boundaries are defined by God's higher design, not by shifting cultural trends or personal desires.
Right, because culture is always changing.
Exactly. Second, it highlights that human failings often mirror whatever the surrounding culture normalizes. Just like Egypt and Canaan normalized exploitation, well, every era has its own blind spots.
Including ours. And I think the challenge is recognizing when you're just passively absorbing the toxic environment around you versus building something genuinely distinct.
That's so true. Third, violating these structural designs brings documented historical consequences. Every single example we discussed, Amnon, Judah, Reuben, Absalom, Jacob, they all resulted in collapsed families, loss of honor, and long-term generational damage.
Yeah, these aren't abstract theories. They are detailed case studies of societal collapse.
Exactly, which leads to the fourth and most critical lesson. These laws are inherently protective. It completely changes how we view ancient moral codes.
It really does. We tend to see them as restrictive fences designed to trap us and ruin our fun. But this framework presents them as the vital architectural blueprints of a society trying desperately not to collapse in on itself.
This raises an important question, though. It shifts the perspective entirely from restriction to preservation. The structures we build our lives upon have deep, lasting consequences for everyone connected to us.
Well, thank you so much for bringing such a thought-provoking, structurally rich document to the table today. We've seen how these ancient codes were specifically designed to protect the vulnerable from power imbalances within that closed ecosystem of a family. They clearly recognize that individual actions can fracture entire communities.
Yeah, a single choice rarely affects only a single person.
Which leaves us with one final thing to chew on. Modern society has an intense, almost exclusive focus on purely individual consent. Like, if two adults agree to something, we generally consider it acceptable and totally off limits to critique.
Right, that's the modern baseline.
But considering everything we've just unpacked about the interconnected web of family structures, how might that extreme focus on the individual be blinding us to the broader ripple effects our relational choices have on our extended family and community?
That's a profound question.
If we only ask, is this okay for me right now? Are we forgetting to check if we are knocking out a load-bearing wall? Something for you to think about as you figure out the house rules for whatever new neighborhood you find yourself in.